"We have something exciting to share with you," my father said, smiling like he was offering me a Christmas gift. My mother sat beside him, her hands folded too neatly in her lap. Between them, on the coffee table, lay a plain white envelope. Waited. The room smelled faintly of pine and dust. The Christmas tree blinked unevenly in the corner, its branches drooping under tired ornaments. "It's an incredible opportunity," my mother said. "Early college admission, paid internship in Chicago." I frowned. I hadn't applied for anything in Chicago. I hadn't even heard about a program. "You'll be independent," my father added, voice warm like honey hiding the knife. "You're ready for this. It's the best thing for everyone." My stomach twisted. Everyone. Not me. In the corner, my grandmother shifted, her cane tapping once against the floor. "Maybe Emma should decide," she said softly. Neither of my parents turned their heads. "It's already arranged," my father said. "The paperwork is signed. Flights are booked. You leave the day after Christmas." My breath caught in my throat. Not even a conversation, just a one-way ticket out. That night, dragging my duffel bag toward the door, I heard them again. The study door was half open. Their voices floated out. "Cleaner this way," my father said. "No distractions. No liabilities before the merger." "She would have ruined everything," my mother whispered back. "Better she's out of sight." I gripped the strap of my bag until the nylon cut into my palms. I wasn't leaving for an opportunity. I was being deleted. No one came to the door when I stepped outside. The porch light stayed dark. The snow under my sneakers cracked loud and lonely. I walked without looking back, the cold slicing through my jacket, the streetlights growing smaller, behind me. They hadn't sent me away to help me. They had thrown me out to save themselves. I spent Christmas Eve in a motel off the highway, the kind where the neon sign flickered and the air smelled of wet carpet. I sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing my jacket, picking at a vending machine sandwich while the TV cycled through muted holiday specials. The silence around me felt thicker than the cold outside. I kept checking my phone even though I already knew. No calls, no messages, not even a Merry Christmas from anyone. When Christmas morning came, I unlocked my screen one more time. More out of reflex than hope, and found exactly what I expected. Nothing. Against my better judgment, I opened social media. The feed exploded with pictures from home. My family's living room lit up brighter than I remembered, the tree perfectly trimmed, the smiles so wide they almost looked pasted on. Evan stood front and center, flanked by my parents, all polished. And proud. The caption read, "Proud to celebrate another year with our one and only shining star." I stared at the photo, my fingers tightening around the phone. There was a gap where I used to stand, not blurred, not acknowledged, simply gone. 2 weeks later, my Uncle James called. For one breathless second, I thought maybe, just maybe, someone had realized what they'd done, but his voice told me otherwise before he even got through the second sentence. "They needed some of my old school records," he said, "for paperwork. It was urgent. He didn't ask how I was, didn't even pretend." I promised to send them and hung up before he could offer whatever awkward apology he wasn't going to mean anyway. Days, blurred together. I found work stocking shelves at a 24-hour grocery store, spending my nights folding myself into a lumpy mattress in the corner of another cheap motel. Sometimes I caught glimpses of home on the news, Evan being interviewed about the family legacy and their commitment to excellence. My parents standing proudly behind him, smiling for a camera they had always cared more about than me. The sting didn't hit like a slap anymore. It was quieter, deeper, like a stone settling at the bottom of a frozen lake. I understood it now. I hadn't been forgotten. I had been erased, carefully and completely, and if I wanted to exist again, I'd have to start somewhere they could never touch. It was early February when Mr. Dalton found me. I was leaving the grocery store after a long night shift, the sun just starting to scrape across the icy parking lot. He stood by his rusted pickup, hands jammed deep into his coat pockets, his breath puffing white in the cold. "Emma!" he called out, his voice the same slow drawl I remembered from my childhood. I hadn't seen him in years, Not since before everything fell apart. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to pretend I hadn't heard, to disappear back into the dark morning. But there was something in the way he held himself, stiff, uneasy, that made me stop. He shuffled closer, pulling a folded sheet of paper from inside his jacket. "I wasn't sure if I should give you this," he said, "but I figured you deserved to know." I took the paper with frozen fingers. It was a printed email chain, the headers still visible, dates circled in thick red ink, my parents' names at the top. Sent weeks before they ever sat me down in the living room. The words blurred for a moment as my vision stung from the wind, or maybe something else. Liabilities must be cleared before the merger. Emma's situation creates instability. Action must be taken before year-end family review. Each line cut sharper than the one before. Not just a decision, a plan. A clean, clinical removal, like cutting out a bad investment. I folded the paper carefully, tucking it into my jacket. My hands were steady now, calmer than I would have expected. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. He nodded, eyes full of something that looked too much like pity. As I walked away, my breath curling into the freezing air, I realized the truth had always been there, in the way they smiled too tightly, spoke too carefully, loved me just enough to look good in public. They hadn't stumbled into pushing me out. They had signed and sealed it like any other business. Transaction. And now, finally, I understood. I wasn't the black sheep. I was the cost of doing business. For weeks, the paper from Mr. Dalton burned a hole in my jacket pocket. I carried it everywhere, a reminder that my exile hadn't been a misunderstanding or a moment of weakness. It had been business. Cold, calculated, and necessary. At least for them, when the weather warmed enough to make the sidewalks slushy, I found myself sitting at a public library computer, staring at news articles I hadn't had the heart to read before. I typed in my family's company name and scrolled through pages of glowing coverage. Awards, speaking engagements, charity galas. Evan's face popped up in nearly every photo, confident and polished, shaking hands with politicians and business leaders. But buried further down, past the headlines and carefully staged interviews, was a quieter truth. Small mentions in financial journals, hints of debts, lawsuits quietly settled, vendors unpaid for months, patterns that anyone paying attention would have noticed. I dug deeper, pulling reports from court filings and business registries. It didn't take long to find the cracks Evan had painted over. A string of bad investments made under his leadership, properties bought at inflated prices, sold at a loss, shell companies shifting money in circles to hide short the facade of perfection had been rotting from the inside for years. My family hadn't sent me away to teach me independence. They had erased me to save Evan's crumbling kingdom. A family portrait with one golden son looked far better to investors than a fractured one with a daughter they couldn't explain. In some twisted way, I realized, they might have even believed it was for my own good. Maybe they thought struggle would harden me, that survival would make me strong. Maybe that was how they slept at night. I leaned back in the stiff library chair, staring at the ceiling tiles overhead. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, the smell of old books and stale coffee filling the air. They hadn't just abandoned me to protect Evan. They had rewritten the narrative of who belonged and who didn't, who mattered and who was disposable, and they had been wrong about one thing. I wasn't broken. I wasn't lost. I was awake now, and I was just getting started. The weeks that followed blurred into a cycle of early mornings and late nights, endless shifts stacking shelves at the grocery store and scraping together rent for a room the size of a closet. Every dollar mattered. Every hour without sleep felt like another tax for sins I hadn't committed. I wasn't building anything yet. I was surviving, barely. There were nights when I sat alone in the diner across from the bus station, nursing a burnt cup of coffee I couldn't afford, watching families laugh over meals I couldn't order. It would have been easy to believe that this was all I was ever going to have. Invisible, disposable, forgotten. Then one night, a woman noticed me. She owned the second-hand bookstore next to the diner, Ms. Wren. White hair twisted into a bun, wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose. She had a voice like worn velvet and a sharpness behind her gaze that reminded me of all the people who had underestimated me. "You're here late," she said as she slid into the booth across from me, uninvited but not unwelcome. I managed a tired smile and shrugged. "Long shift." She studied me for a moment, then reached into her purse and pulled out a flyer. "We need someone at the shop, part-time. Sorting, cataloging. It's not glamorous, but you look like someone who knows how to work." I hesitated, unsure if it was pity or genuine offer, but something in her tone, no nonsense, almost gruff, made me believe her. I took the flyer and tucked it into my jacket without promising anything. Hope was a dangerous thing when you all had nothing left. The next morning, I walked into her shop before I could talk myself out of it. The smell of old paper and wood polish hit me like a wave. It wasn't much. A cramped back room stacked with boxes and shelves sagging under the weight of forgotten stories. But it was something. It was a place. Ms. Wren didn't ask for my resume. She just handed me a clipboard and said, "Start with the biographies. They're a mess." I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. It wasn't a grand beginning. It wasn't even a plan yet, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't running from the past. I was building something toward a future they couldn't erase. The bookstore job didn't make me rich. It didn't make headlines, but it gave me something more important, a foothold. Every night after closing, I stayed late, reading about things I had never dared dream about before. Business models, startup histories, market trends. I wasn't just passing time anymore. I was sharpening skills no one knew I had. 2 years later, I spotted a notice tucked in the corner of a bulletin board at the library. A local tech startup was looking for entry-level assistants. The pay was terrible. The hours were worse. I applied anyway. When they called, I was ready. At first, I did everything no one else wanted to. I fetched coffee, ran errands, organized messy data files. I kept my head down and my mouth shut. But I watched. I listened. I learned. Within a year, I was no longer the girl delivering coffee. I was drafting strategies, building workflows, streamlining chaos into something that looked like order. When the company pivoted into logistics optimization, a market most people thought was too complicated to touch, I was the one who raised my hand and said, "Let's do it differently." People started listening. Growth followed. By the time I was 24, I wasn't just part of the company. I was leading it, quietly, relentlessly, without ever once announcing who I was or where I had come from. That first Christmas after our big expansion, I walked into a small gift shop and picked out a thick wool shawl, the kind my grandmother used to knit when her hands were still steady. I boxed it carefully, wrapped it in brown paper, and sent it with no return address. I didn't sign a card. I didn't need to. I wasn't chasing recognition. I wasn't chasing anything anymore. I had already built something bigger than their approval could ever offer. And I was only getting started. The email came through late on a Wednesday, buried between contract drafts and quarterly reports. Clark Enterprises, desperate to modernize their collapsing logistics division, had sent out a blind request for proposals. They had no idea who they were reaching. I didn't hesitate. I didn't gloat. I simply forwarded the request to my team and scheduled the meeting. It was raining the morning I walked into the conference room, the kind of steady, soaking rain that muted the city into a blur of gray. I wore a simple dark suit, no jewelry, no flash, just quiet authority. No one at the front desk asked my name. They assumed I belonged. Inside, the boardroom buzzed with nervous energy. Papers shuffled, chairs scraped. I recognized the silhouettes around the table before I saw their faces fully. My father's rigid posture, my mother's polished smile stretched just a little too tight, Evan fidgeting with his cufflinks like he always did when he was cornered. None of them looked up when I entered. Not at first. It was the lead consultant, an old business acquaintance of theirs, who noticed me first. His eyes widened slightly, his lips parting in surprise before he caught himself. He leaned over to whisper something to Evan, whose head snapped up so fast it made his chair squeak. For a long moment, no one moved. The room, so full of false warmth a moment ago, turned cold enough to crack. My father's face paled, his mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but no words came. My mother's hands clenched together so tightly her knuckles turned white. Evan simply stared, frozen halfway between arrogance and fear. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I walked to the head of the table, set my portfolio down, and took my seat. The contract with our company's letterhead sat neatly on the top, positioned where they couldn't miss it. Silence stretched, heavy and awkward. I let it. For once, they couldn't edit me out of the picture. They couldn't crop me away or pretend I wasn't there. I was the room now. I was the deal. And whether they liked it or not, the future they needed came with my name written across. I let the silence stretch until the nervous shifting around the table grew too loud to ignore. Paper rustled. A pen clicked twice, too fast, too hard. I didn't move. I wanted them to sit with it. The reality of who was across from them. Now finally, the lead negotiator cleared his throat and asked if I would like to walk them through the contract terms. I smiled. The room leaned in as I spoke. My voice stayed calm, steady, outlining logistic solutions, optimization strategies, delivery frameworks, all the technical promises they were desperate to hear. I kept it professional, detached, not. A hint of personal history crept into my tone. But the contract was more than it appeared. Buried deep in the clauses, in language dry enough to lull any casual reader, was a condition my legal team had crafted carefully. Should Clark Enterprises fail to meet performance targets within 18 months, full operational control would revert to us. Quietly, legally, without any further negotiation, a lifeline disguised as a leash. When I finished my presentation, I slid the contract across the table. My father's hand hesitated over the pen. My mother leaned forward as if she could somehow will the fine print to change. "This looks thorough," the consultant said, his voice brittle with forced optimism. "And you're certain the partnership terms are standard?" I met his gaze squarely. "Absolutely. Standard for companies committed to excellence." He nodded, pretending to understand, pretending this was still a negotiation. I watched my father sign first. His hand trembled so slightly most people wouldn't have noticed. But I did. My mother followed, her signature sharp and brittle on the page. Evan added his last, the ink smudging just enough to betray the shake in his fingers. When the final signature dried, I gathered the folder with care, tucking it back into my briefcase. For a brief second, our eyes met. Mine calm, theirs hollow. They had no idea what they had just handed me, or maybe, deep down, they did. I rose from my seat, smoothed the front of my jacket, and smiled the kind of smile I had learned from watching them all my life, the one that said everything while saying nothing. This time, it was my story being written, and they had just signed their part without reading the ending. I stepped out of the building into the soft drizzle, the kind that blurred the city into watercolor smudges. The rain cooled the heat rising in my chest, washing away the last traces of adrenaline. No one followed me. No one called my name. Just like that night years ago when I walked away from home, there was no one watching. It didn't hurt the way I thought it might. There was no grand satisfaction, no flashing moment of triumph. Only a steady, quiet peace settling into my bones, as if some heavy weight I'd carried too long had finally slipped free. Later that night, as I sat by my apartment window, nursing a cup of tea gone cold, I saw the notification. A message from a name I hadn't seen in years, my grandmother. It wasn't long, just a few lines in shaky handwriting photographed and sent. "I'm sorry I didn't fight harder. I always saw you. I always loved you. I hope you know that." I stared at the screen for a long time, the rain tapping gently against the glass. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. Some wounds didn't demand tears anymore. They had simply become part of the landscape inside me, familiar, weathered, harmless. Without thinking, I opened a banking app and arranged a quiet transfer, enough to cover her medical expenses, enough to make sure she could live comfortably without needing to ask for anyone's permission. I didn't sign my name. I didn't need to. The next morning, I boxed up the old contract papers, the final signed copies bearing the signatures that had once locked me out. I tucked them away in the back of a drawer, not out of malice, but because I didn't need them displayed. Victory wasn't a trophy to hang on the wall. It was a door I had walked through and quietly closed behind me. I wasn't the story they told. I was the one they couldn't erase, and I was already far beyond their reach.